A very warm welcome indeed to all of you. My name is Mark Goldie, and I've been a fellow of this college for quite a long time. And while it's the job of nearly all the fellows of Churchill to dwell in the present and the future, I'm paid a salary to dwell in the past. I hope I feel suitably humble in talking about the history of this college, because I know that there are many of you here who can help me, and I hope will help me, deepen and thicken the data and thoughts and ideas and subjective experiences that you have had here in the past. And I look forward to speaking with as many of you I can later on. Churchill College likes to congratulate itself on being the first men's college to decide to admit women. So it is salutary to recall that Churchill was also the last college to be founded for men only. An all-male college was conventional in 1960, but inconceivable just a decade later. The college was caught on the hop by the cultural revolution of the 60s, but was able to respond by reforming. The momentous decision was made on Saturday, the 8th of March, 1969, by a thumping majority of 51 votes to 5. Name the guilty men. My story is of men who thought they were progressive. The university abolished its statute forbidding mixed colleges in 1965. The first mixed institutions were the postgraduate colleges. The rest of the university then embarked on an often bitterly fought struggle for change, with Churchill, King's and Clare being the first to admit women students in 1972, and Magdalen, of course, being the last in 1988. The story is a late episode in a long saga with roots in Victorian Cambridge. One aspect of the so-called Revolution of the Dons was the creation of colleges for women, Girton and Newnham, between 1869 and 73. They were, of course, met with suspicion, hostility, and ridicule. Until the 1930s, there were strict rules of chaperoning. And it's a staggering fact that degrees were not formally awarded to women until 1948. From an early stage, women were permitted to sit university exams, but their names were excluded from the class list. This led to conspicuous injustices. In 1890, Philippa Fawcett was placed above the top wrangler in mathematics. Today, the university has begun to commemorate those early pioneers, and there is a Philippa Fawcett Drive recently named on the West Cambridge Science Campus. Here is a famous Punch cartoon of 1887. Mr. Punch shows Agneta Ramsey to her first-class carriage. But it's a viciously double-edged cartoon, because notice the little dog performing on his hind legs. And here is the mob of male undergraduates at a famous vote in the Senate House in 1897. They lynched, as you see, an effigy of a woman on a bicycle, that symbol of emancipation. It was a long saga which evoked in 1922 a famous definition of Cambridge by a royal commission, a men's university, though of a mixed type. It's tempting to assume that social progress follows a neat upward curve from darkness to enlightenment. But the growth of women's rights and the vibrancy of feminism has been uneven. First-wave feminism produced major progress for women in universities between 1900 and 1930, but then it stalled until the 1960s. After the war, the cause of women slumped. They were sent back to domesticity. Between 1945 and 1960, the median age of marriage for women was 21, the lowest in the century. John Bowlby's classic book, Childcare and the Growth of Love, 1953, My Mother's Bible, lectured women on the dangers for children of maternal deprivation. And the world of Oxbridge and the British establishment in the 50s was perhaps at its most masculinist of the century. The memorandum of industrialists whose discussions led to the creation of Churchill College dwelt only on the serious shortage in technology of first-class men. Yet the voice of feminism was not absent when the new college was announced in 1958. In June of that year, Sir Winston Churchill received a letter from the Women's Freedom League urging him to back a pioneer co-educational college, and another from the Council for the Economic Emancipation of the Woman Worker, the Federation of Soroptimist Clubs of Great Britain met at their annual conference in Scarborough and passed a resolution. This conference welcomes the proposed establishment of a new college for science and technology at Cambridge and urges that its facilities should be available for women as well as men. But the college trustees dug in their heels. The response of one, Air Marshal Lord Tedder, commander of the RAF on D-Day, was disdainful. I have the attached letter from the women. I imagine they have also attacked Sir Winston. Another, Lord Fleck, chairman of ICI, curtly wrote, "It's proper that the public appeal should be for a men's college." The trustees were emphatic that the appeal had gone out to 5,000 firms on the clear understanding that it would be for men, and the admission of women is contrary to what those firms were asked to pay for. But the women's organisations struck positive chords with Winston himself. A scribbled memo in near panic, 16th of June 1958, records Winston's opinion that women should be admitted. It seems he was prompted by his wife, Clementine. Jock Colville describes a meeting of the trustees at Winston's home in Hyde Park Gate. He writes, "We were all astonished when Winston announced that he hoped the new college would admit women. No college at Oxford or Cambridge had ever done such a thing. I asked him afterwards if this had been Clementine's idea. 'Yes,' he said, 'and I support it. When I think of what women did in the war, I feel sure they deserve to be treated equally.'" His remark about the war is telling, for it reminds us of an argument made by historians that movements for social reform are often accelerated as much by the upheavals of total war as by the campaigning of idealists. Winston may have had in mind his own daughter, Mary, who served in the first mixed-sex anti-aircraft gun batteries and came under enemy fire at the age of 20. But we mustn't get sentimental about Winston. His record on the women question was decidedly mixed. In 1896, he said female suffrage was ridiculous and irrelevant to the duty of women marrying and giving birth. But during his liberal reform phase in 1904, he voted in favour. But then he backtracked in the face of the Pankhurst's militancy. In 1909, he was horsewhipped by a suffragette on Bristol Station. During the Second War, he forced the House of Commons to reject equal pay for women schoolteachers. And a man who, in 1956, could complain of the nation's loss of virility and masculinity is hard to recruit for feminism. You can't, of course, see the detail on this letter, but I show these items for the flavour of them. Sometimes Winston's influence did persuade the trustees, but on this matter they balked him. Colville wrote him a long letter warning him that the university had already swallowed one revolutionary proposal, a specialist science college, and to propose a mixed college, and I love the following phrase, it's on the last line here, to propose a mixed college would be like dropping a hydrogen bomb in the middle of the university. So the trustees launched their male college, and it was left to the fellows to make the change a decade later. Long before it contemplated taking women as members, the college acquired a reputation for 60s forwardness. As early as 1961, the college decided that fellows should be allowed to bring in lady guests on any one night, but it should be the general practice not to bring in one lady more than 3 times in any one term. Should a fellow wish to depart from this practice, he should first approach the vice-master. So when the dining hall was officially opened in 1964, the photograph of the first dinner shows clearly lady diners. However, fellows were not permitted to bring their own wives until 1966, though some circumvented this by inviting each other's wives. A few days ago, I received an email from the wife of a fellow elected in 1961, herself with a doctorate, who still remembers her deep irritation at being banished from high table. And yet Churchill was ahead of the mores of the time. Queen's, for example, didn't admit women to high table till 1968, Magdalen not till 1974. And even the new mixed colleges could get their knickers in a twist about female fellows. The following quote is from a hand-wringing memorandum by the master of one of the graduate colleges in 1966 concerning the etiquette of moving from the common room to the dining room. I quote, "I have thought it right to lead, with guests, the movement into and out of the dining room without any thought that precedence should be given to women at doors. I shall expect any woman fellow that we elect to accept such a custom without hesitation, and not to expect that, qua fellow, she will be treated differently from her male brethren." Although the decision to admit women to Churchill did not occur until 1969, the possibility of admission was agreed in 1965. The college charter had to be revised, the only charter amendment in our history. Learning that the college was considering the matter, John Oriel, Shell Petroleum, wrote grumpily that the college was wasting its time. "It's not our priority. There is such a lot to be done, and wrangling about women seems not relevant." It was in April 1965 that the governing body voted to amend the charter. The bursar reassured Lord Godber, also Shell Petroleum, that there is no intention to admit women undergraduates, but it's felt that the college may wish to include lady dons. The remark reminds us that the question of woman undergraduates was not necessarily the chief focus of attention. Facilities for postgraduates and for academics were the headline reforms of the mid-60s. And remember that New Hall later decided to admit male fellows, but has never yet admitted male students. So in 65, the master, Sir John Cockcroft, wrote, "I think it's extremely unlikely that we will wish to admit women undergraduates, and if we take any step, it will probably be the election to fellowships of women who are now doing a substantial amount of teaching for the college." College council conceded that the appointment of lady dons might lead to a demand for the admission of postgraduates and undergraduates, spelt like launderette. And council then did weigh up the case. In favour was the likelihood that academic standards would rise through greater competition for places. But against, it noted that the mixing of men and women in the closed environment of a Cambridge college might have an adverse effect on studies and discipline, and that there was no pressure from the junior members to allow the admission of women. By the close of the 1960s, opinion had shifted. When it came to it, very few fellows voted against, and the college was spared the hostilities that occurred elsewhere. And yet, looking back on their deliberations, I'm struck by the fellows' apprehension of the enormity of their proposal. They were filled with a sense of daring and trepidation. The implications of co-residence seemed mountainous. Everything from sewing machines to abortions had to be considered. The driving force was Dick Tizard, appointed senior tutor in 1965, a man later described as Cambridge's greatest reforming senior tutor of the post-war era. In 1966, he started a correspondence with wardens of mixed halls of residence throughout the country. A male professor from Aberdeen wrote that standards of cleanliness and dress are higher in a mixed hall. A female warden at Birmingham thought that in mixed halls there was less of the gang hooliganism of men's halls and less of the hysteria of women's halls. In a long paper of October 1967, Tizard presented a gamut of arguments for and against. In favour, the likely improvement in admissions by cutting off the tail of weak males. The probable improvement of conduct, dress and behaviour. The increase of women qualified for the professions. Better educated mothers to benefit the next generation of sons. He cited the fact that 40% of Russian engineers were women. And remember that during the Cold War, Russia was as much admired as feared for its science. His final reason was very telling, simply because we want to be modern and with it, and don't want another college to do it first. With admirable fairness, he spelt out 7 arguments against, ranging from the little direct return to industry, to unwanted pregnancies, a decline in the college's moral reputation, and the likely objection of women's colleges. But then the matter stalled because of Cockcroft's sudden death in the autumn of 1967. The second master, Sir William Hawthorne, was a potential roadblock, for he was hostile. In the event, the college would make its decision despite him, the most momentous defiance of a master in the college's history. Tizard was indefatigable, and he parked his tank on the master's lawn. Hawthorne, who helped invent the jet engine, was also a keen amateur conjurer. And in retrospect, his favourite party trick, you see here in the dining hall, of sawing a woman in half, seems somehow evidence of his deeper feelings. In a remarkable and faintly absurd surge of bureaucratic energy, 8 working parties worked through the winter of 1968-9, involving 50 fellows to consider every implication of admitting women. And their deliberations I will pause upon because it offers us a wonderful zoo of defunct attitudes. Let's for the moment bring them back again. The admissions committee looked at Tripos' performance at admission standards. It thought probably standards would be high in English and modern languages, higher for women than men. In natural sciences and maths, probably lower, and that the likelihood of recruiting women for engineering would be very low. It considered but rejected gender quotas by subject. It's worth noting that until quite a late stage, the university itself had set a university-wide ceiling of 1/5 women undergraduates. The Committee on Fellowships set its face against a 2-tier system of appointments and resolved to elect purely on merit, and yet its further deliberations rather backtracked on this. The problem was that the pool of women holding university posts and available for election to fellowships was small. It was considered imperative that women students should have a woman tutor. Consequently, the college might have to spend money on salaries to employ its own tutors for women. The committee minuted its report for equal pay for women. Remember that the Equal Pay Act was not passed until the following year, 1970. The committee then noted that there were 500 resident MAs, female MAs, in Cambridge, and that remark carried the strong implication that women appointed to tutorial roles need not have doctorates and need not be expected to have a serious research career. The Committee on Rooms and Buildings visited women's colleges and held meetings with fellows' wives. They pondered the difficulty of a college which seemed to them to have masculinity built into its bricks and mortar, for it was, quote, not designed with co-residence in mind. And indeed, there was a historic assumption that corridors rather than staircases were the proper architecture for women's colleges. This committee thought it would be impossible to allow mixed staircases. And since the college was unique in having no surrounding wall, it was felt necessary to consider enclosing the college. This would involve, quote, building a barrier, perhaps of armoured glass, across the open accesses. An imperative need was for more bathrooms, and it was proposed that the storage room on each staircase should be converted into a bathroom and an ironing room. Similarly, the college needed a sewing room, together with an enlargement of the sick bay and accommodation for a residential nurse or matron who must be a married woman. The following is true. A fellow in economics fastidiously pointed out, with a little lecture on the concept of opportunity cost, that it would be cheaper to buy every woman undergraduate their own sewing machine than to forego the rental on a set-aside sewing room. The tutorial committee agreed that female students should have women tutors and male students men. They consulted the current undergraduates, who said that there would be strong feelings among some men that they would prefer to have a man as a tutor. Consequently, a 1/3 female student body needed 3 female tutors. And worried about the cost, they considered that they rejected other alternatives, such as the girls having men tutors, but as well, the college also having, quote, a motherly person to whom they could go or be sent. Or perhaps the girls might be tutored by wives of fellows. The committee further recommended that one responsible woman be in the college at any time of day or night. They judged that there should be a single disciplinary dean and that it should be a man, because, quote, it was probably easier for a young woman to accept a man as the voice of authority than for a young man to accept a woman. The committee thought probably no need to change visiting hours. Currently, guests had to leave at 2 a.m., but that there might be a case for imposing a, quote, mandatory segregation time. But you haven't heard the end of it. Lastly, the committee turned to sexual disciplinary problems and came to the following conclusions. I won't quote all of this, just the best bits. We recommend that girls be treated the same way as men. Note girls, men. The college's present policy is A. College's present policy is that it disapproves of fornication, and offenders are sent to live in digs. Although this is not entirely a suitable punishment, it was thought to be as suitable for women as for men. Skip to C. The general practice at Newnham and Girton is that girls who become pregnant may go away and have their babies and return to take their degrees. This is perfectly reasonable. D. A variety of sexual misdemeanour is imaginable, though unlikely. E. On the evidence of the ladies' colleges, we may expect few pregnancies and abortions. F. It must be remembered that probably only about a quarter of the girls will form liaisons within the college anyhow. Well, over this document, a shadow of in loco parentis moralism hangs, though I sense it lacked conviction. The age of majority was not reduced to 18 until a little later in 1970, and we ought to remember that universities were deeply fearful of public and newspaper condemnation of campus promiscuity. That lurked over their shoulders. What is striking is how much this document speaks of an era which hadn't quite yet grasped the impact of reliable contraception. One fellow, and the following quotation is in the record, thought it might be prudent to, quote, recommend to their pupils the use of heavy petting. Bracket, mutual and manual stimulation to the point of climax, close bracket, rather than intercourse with penetration, close quote. What I like about that quotation is how this fellow, good teacher that he was, pauses to define technical terms. Another fellow thought it would be an improvement if the students would in future be sleeping with brainy women rather than such traditional resorts as the barmaid at the Bull or the girl behind the tobacconist's counter. Finally, the Committee on Statutes considered changing the title of Master to a neutral one. Selwyn College, in fact, did later change its statutes, I think the only Cambridge college, so that a male shall be master and a female mistress. Although this sort of linguistic anxiety, I think, has disappeared and didn't raise its head in Churchill when we elected Dame Athene in 2014. Well, this vast body of material, and again, you can't read this, but I show it just as the historic, get a glimpse of the historic minute of governing body. All this paper was sent to governing body, which, sitting on a Saturday in March 1969, passed its historic resolution. There were strings attached. There was to be a ceiling of 40 women a year, undergraduates, and the college would increase its total intake by 80 so that the number of men would not decrease. This placated those who still worried about obligations to the industrial sponsors. Such stipulations occurred also in the United States, where Princeton and Yale initially ring-fenced a quota of men, so that truly gender-blind admission didn't follow till some years later. The master, Hawthorne, voted against. He asked one newly elected fellow, "What do you think of women?" To which the new fellow replied, "I think they're rather a good idea." To which Hawthorne responded, "You must be a socialist." And the first thing Hawthorne said to Alison Finch upon her election was, "Well, Miss Finch, I voted against the admission of women." Who else opposed? Well, the bursar, Major General Jack Hamilton, thought Tizard's pet project was troublesome and difficult. Richard Adrian, later Master of Pembroke, was against. Another suggested it would be better to promote the creation of a fourth woman's college. But the college had cast its vote overwhelmingly, and just in time to book its tiny place in the history books. Clare College followed its decision 5 weeks later. The master wrote to inform the industrial benefactors, and some trustees clung to their old position. Lord Godber and Lord Plowden wrote back that since the college had been founded for science and engineering, and since women don't do those subjects, the decision was a betrayal of the college's founding purpose. On the other hand, an intriguing letter came from Barnes Wallis, inventor of the bouncing bomb, who thought it an excellent move and reminisced about having, during the war, recruited women mathematicians to his staff. The senior tutor wrote to 3,000 schools and was very conscious of the need of a public relations exercise to convince parents and schools that, quote, Churchill would be a decent place for their girls to go. There was a row about a press release. Tizard's enthusiastic manifesto, "No society should neglect half of its intellectual talent," was watered down by Hawthorne. Most schools were content, but one headmaster said that a mixed college would, quote, appeal to a certain type of girl and a certain type of boy, and that no boy from our school will apply to Churchill in the future. Within Oxbridge, Tizard now faced queues of masters, senior tutors, and reforming fellows anxious to promote the cause in their own colleges. There were soon fears that government might outlaw single-sex institutions, though in the event, the Sex Discrimination Act of 1975 exempted educational institutions. When Churchill, King's and Clare simultaneously admitted women in 1972, a Selwyn College committee pronounced the move was worth considering because Clare was one of these. Their minute was, King's has a reputation for radicalism, Churchill was new and swayed by fashion, but Clare was old and sound. The women's colleges were not enthusiastic. They immediately recognised the long-term problems it created for them. And in 1970, Newnham asked Churchill to delay opening its research fellowship competition to women for fear of poaching, especially as Newnham paid lower salaries. This low pay was not just because Newnham was poorer. It was a matter of policy, designed to keep young women on the straight and narrow of research. Newnham, a women's college, explained, we do not pay children's allowances because research fellows should not sacrifice their research to bring up children. We need to remember that a marriage bar in women's colleges in Oxbridge survived quite late. Well, in 1972, 34 women undergraduates and 14 postgraduates arrived. The college elected its first woman fellow, Daphne Osborne, a botanist, and then 2 other women soon followed. Alison Finch in French literature. I hope Alison, who's here, won't mind me saying I love this picture because it's so 1972. And Pat Wright in psychology. Alison later became the college's first woman vice-master. But on arrival, quickly elected to college council, she was advised by a senior fellow not to say anything for a year. Several stipulations quickly collapsed. The ceiling on numbers of women students, the confinement of men and women to single-sex staircases, the notion that women students had to have a female tutor. No protective wall was built. The trunk rooms were not converted to extra bathrooms. No sewing room was set aside. And no woman fellow was required to be nocturnally present. But gendered conventions lingered. An institution called ladies' evenings persisted until the 1990s. More seriously, some of the statistics about fellowships are shocking. After the election of the first 4 women in 1971-3, not a single woman was elected to a fellowship until 1980. And you see here the graph of elections to fellowships of women only creeping up slowly to stand where it does now. About 20% currently of the fellowship is female. If we look at science fellows, we see often elections of women in science to fellowships flatlining quite often until the new century, when at last it begins stutteringly to pick up. As for undergraduate numbers, during the 1970s, the proportion averaged 30%, but by the 1980s was down to 20%. The reasons are not hard to find. Other colleges had gone mixed, so Churchill was no longer special. But above all, the college was and still is up against the deep-seated problem of the unwillingness of schoolgirls to opt for science. Today we have returned to around 30% women undergraduates, but the university has 50%. There is a further and more sensitive dimension that has yet to be understood and is a gaping hole in this talk, namely the subjective experience of the early generations of women students and fellows. Minute books notoriously are not good at recording the timbre of college life. Tizard was full of optimistic reassurances that everything was hunky-dory. But to what extent did those early women students have to put up with being gawped, groped, ignored, patronized? Here is a deeply felt picture painted in the 1980s. It is called Crucifixion at High Table and depicts Philippa Comber, the college's first female professional student counsellor, nearly naked, crucified, the cross jammed through a table of leering, inebriated men fellows. Churchill's decision to go mixed was, of course, made entirely by men. Was it a radical move? Were these men feminists? For all the college's self-vaunting pride about its reforming moment, arguably the fellows merely surfed the zeitgeist. It was the swinging 60s, and they wanted to be with it. The new universities were visibly putting Oxbridge to shame. In 1965, 10% of Cambridge undergraduates were women, but about 30% nationally, and 45% at Sussex University. In the wider world, second-wave feminism was just beginning to stir, with such books as Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique of 1963. And looking at the wider canvas, in just 5 years, 1969 to 74, dozens of American universities and Oxbridge colleges made the same decision. In her recent impressive history, Nancy Malkiel argues that the principal motive was a desire to achieve a competitive edge, to grab female talent. She shows how visceral was the opposition in the USA, chiefly because of the influence and economic power of male alumni. Her book takes its title from a Dartmouth alumnus, class of 1920. Churchill had the advantage of having no juggernaut of elderly male alumni, though it had the equivalent in the juggernaut of male elderly industrial donors, at a time when technology and business remained overwhelmingly masculine. There is, I believe, finally, a philosophical dimension that arguably robs the male fellows of Churchill of feminist credentials. In the surviving archive, the language of rights or justice rarely surfaced. Rather, the mindset was utilitarian and technocratic, concerned with competitive edge, fashionability, and above all, in the favourite phrase of the time, untapped brain power. Thank you very much.